Elias Thorne wasn't the kind of man who sought attention. He was the kind of person who built things with his hands, things that lasted. After serving a stint in the army and spending most of his adult life as a legal clerk in a rural county courthouse, he retired to the cabin he had built with his wife, Emily, tucked in a small community nestled between two ridges in the Pacific Northwest. The air there was clean, the mornings were quiet, and the rhythm of life moved with the seasons, not the clock. That cabin was more than timber and nails. It was where he and Emily had planted wildflowers around the porch and strung lights above the back patio. It was where their son, Liam, had taken his first steps. It was where they laughed and grieved and grew older together, until Emily passed from cancer 3 years ago. By the time the trouble started, Elias had thought he'd faced his hardest battle. Grief had settled in like winter frost, slow, stubborn, and biting, but he had survived it. What he hadn't expected was that a war of a different sort would come knocking. It started subtly. A knock at the door. A polite woman in a beige pantsuit introduced herself as Karen Millstone, the new president of the local homeowners association. Karen spoke with that saccharine cordiality that never felt quite sincere. She offered condolences for Emily's passing and then, almost too quickly, pivoted to a proposal. The HOA was reorganizing its board, and they wanted Elias to join. "We need more long-timers like yourself to help shape the vision," she said, gesturing with her manicured hand toward the forested hills. Elias politely declined. He wasn't one for meetings, and he'd never formally joined the HOA anyway. His property had been carved out long before the neighborhood development began. A week later, a letter arrived. Folded neatly into an official envelope bearing the HOA's insignia, it read more like an ultimatum than a notice. "You have 72 hours to begin the process of listing your property for sale, or face enforcement action for non-compliance with zoning and sustainability regulations." Elias read it 3 times. His first reaction wasn't fear. It was disbelief. The property, which had belonged to his family for over 4 decades, had never been subject to any such demands. It sat on a legal parcel, verified by county maps and backed by recorded deeds. But something had changed. He contacted the county assessor's office. After hours of waiting and being shuffled from one bureaucrat to another, he finally got an answer. Zoning maps had been redrawn, and new overlays had been placed over areas designated as part of a sustainable residential zone. Somehow, his cabin now sat within that zone, even though it had been excluded from previous drafts. Elias asked for documentation, and what he received didn't sit right. The overlay maps bore recent timestamps and unfamiliar signatures, and the legality seemed questionable at best. 2 days later, the sound of diesel engines shattered the morning stillness. A backhoe trundled up the gravel road, followed by a flatbed truck carrying fencing and demolition equipment. Elias stepped outside, still in his flannel shirt and jeans, and confronted the crew. A man holding a clipboard claimed they were there to begin demolition of an unauthorized structure on behalf of the HOA. The structure in question? His side porch, a wraparound deck that had stood for 17 years, permitted and inspected by the county back when it was built. Elias stood firm, waving them off with a cease and desist letter he drafted himself the night before, citing specific land use laws. The workers, clearly unprepared for a homeowner who knew his rights, eventually left after some heated phone calls. But the message had been sent. Over the next week, the pressure escalated. Surveillance cameras were installed on utility poles facing his property, ostensibly for community safety. His power was shut off for a day without warning. Rumors began to swirl around the neighborhood that Elias was hoarding dangerous materials, that he had become mentally unstable, that his property was attracting vagrants. Even the local post office stopped delivering mail for several days after receiving a complaint that his dogs were aggressive. Though Elias hadn't owned a dog since Emily passed, Liam, now 17, was staying with his father for the summer. He tried to shield his son from the stress, but Liam wasn't blind. He saw the tension in his father's jaw, the stack of legal books growing on the kitchen table, the long phone calls that ended with slamming the receiver back into its cradle. It all came to a head when a social worker showed up unannounced one humid July afternoon. She was responding to an anonymous tip alleging that Liam was being neglected and possibly endangered. Elias invited her in, calmly explained the situation, and showed her around the home. The report was quickly dismissed as unfounded. But the intent was clear. Elias sat at his kitchen table that night, staring at a spread of county plat maps, scanned deeds, and a yellowed manila folder from decades past. Emily had always been the organized one, everything labeled, everything saved. And that folder turned out to be the key. Inside were the original property records from when they first bought the land. There, in black and white, was the boundary line. Not only did it show the limits of their property, but it extended further than the current zoning maps allowed. In fact, it extended directly under the HOA's main office building, a converted farmhouse that had been part of a failed development project years ago. He cross-referenced the land parcel numbers. The HOA office, and about 40 feet surrounding it, was technically on Elias's land. The paperwork was legitimate, the deed clean. Somewhere along the way, the HOA had either failed to verify ownership or had deliberately ignored it. Either way, they had no right to occupy the structure. Elias knew better than to confront them with fury. That would give them leverage. Instead, he documented everything. He drafted a formal letter of intent to collect rent for unauthorized use of property, complete with retroactive billing and a request for backdated payments. He hand-delivered the letter, requested a signature, and filed a copy with the county recorder's office. That was just the beginning. Next, he filed an injunction with the help of an old friend from his courthouse days. It froze all enforcement actions against his property until a full review could be conducted. When the HOA tried to send contractors again, Elias greeted them with a printed copy of the injunction order taped to the front post of his porch. The workers left without a word. Karen, once full of polished smiles and fake warmth, now turned cold. She called Elias a rogue actor at the next community meeting. She claimed he was manipulating outdated records and endangering neighborhood cohesion. But behind the scenes, cracks were beginning to show. Other board members were growing uneasy. Rumors swirled that Karen had expedited the zoning overlays without full board approval. Some documents she had submitted bore the digital signature of a former board member who had moved out of state years ago. Others were missing key timestamps and verifications. Elias played the long game. He started by contacting local journalists, feeding them breadcrumbs. He gave them just enough, copies of the questionable maps, the rent demand, the retaliatory tactics. It didn't take long before a local newspaper picked up the story. The headline read, "We're over a cabin. One man's legal fight against a rogue HOA." Suddenly, the narrative shifted. Neighbors who had once kept their distance started knocking on his door. They shared their own stories, fines for non-existent violations, pressure to sign vague compliance documents, threats for voicing concerns. What had been painted as a lone wolf's rebellion now looked like a community reckoning. And then, everything changed with a single envelope. Left on Elias's porch, it contained a handwritten letter from Karen. No letterhead, no signature block, just ink on lined paper. She confessed. She admitted to forging some of the documentation, to pushing the overlays without due process, to filing the false child welfare report out of desperation. She claimed she had been pressured by a regional HOA consultant to bring all properties into alignment. And she had made decisions she now regretted. Elias didn't gloat. He made copies of the letter, filed it as part of the ongoing case, and forwarded it to the county ethics board. Within weeks, Karen was suspended pending investigation, and the HOA board was dissolved after a special vote triggered by mounting member petitions. A temporary management team was installed by the county to review the HOA's conduct and financials. Liam and Elias stood side by side as they watched the surveillance cameras come down, one by one. They rebuilt the porch together that fall, using reclaimed cedar and the original hand-drawn plans Emily had sketched out years earlier. They hung the same string lights again, soft yellow against the dark trees. For the first time in months, there was silence and peace. The peace that returned to Elias's home wasn't just about the absence of conflict, it was about reclaiming dignity. There's a difference between surviving a storm and rebuilding after one, and Elias understood that more clearly than ever. His porch had been physically rebuilt, yes, but it was the restoration of agency, of voice, of being truly seen and heard, that mattered most. And in the silence that followed the fallout, the small victories became visible in the everyday moments again. Liam helping replant the garden Emily once tended, neighbors offering meals and warm conversation, the thrum of a community waking up from complacency. Yet beneath the stillness, Elias knew the fight wasn't entirely over. Bureaucracy doesn't collapse in a single gesture, it buckles, retreats, and reshapes itself. The temporary board installed by the county had launched a formal audit into the HOA's finances, property dealings, and the legality of its actions under Karen's leadership. In the weeks that followed her suspension, more irregularities surfaced. It turned out the HOA had spent tens of thousands of dollars from reserve funds on legal consultations and enforcement efforts that targeted only a handful of households, Elias's most aggressively. There were also signs of favoritism in zoning approvals, particularly for Karen's brother-in-law, who had recently constructed a large addition without permits but had never been fined. All of it fed into a growing wave of discontent. Residents began to speak out, not just in private conversations, but at town halls and newspaper op-eds. Some who had once turned a blind eye or passively nodded at Karen's decisions were now openly critical. They admitted they had been afraid of retaliation, of fines, of having their lives turned upside down like Elias's. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Callahan, stood up during a public forum and said through tears, "I let this happen. I saw what they did to Elias, and I stayed quiet. That's not who I want to be anymore." The county commission, now under pressure, began discussing the potential for dissolving the HOA permanently and transitioning the neighborhood into a self-governed, optional association with no enforcement power. This idea, once unthinkable, was now gaining traction. And Elias, reluctantly and quietly, became the face of that movement. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. But he understood that staying silent again would mean letting others face the same kind of fear he had endured. So when a local community radio station asked him for an interview, he agreed. Sitting across from the host in a makeshift studio in the back of a bookstore, he spoke plainly, not with anger, but with resolve. He explained the legal loopholes, the weaponization of misinformation, and how even small power structures, left unchecked, can metastasize into something cruel. What resonated most, however, wasn't his legal insight, but the emotional honesty in his voice when he said, "They tried to erase the place where I buried my wife's ashes. That's not governance. That's theft with a smile." That interview went viral in local circles. Shared on social media, discussed at cafes, cited by columnists, it became a rallying cry not just for Elias's community, but for people across the county grappling with similar frustrations. Elias began receiving letters. Not dozens, hundreds. From strangers. Some were handwritten, others typed, all telling versions of the same story. Wrongful HOA penalties, unexplained fines, power abuses cloaked in community language. It was both humbling and horrifying to realize just how widespread the problem had become. And then came the final, unexpected twist. A land surveyor from the county reached out to Elias asking to walk the boundaries of his property. At first, Elias assumed it was a follow-up on the original investigation, but the man, a soft-spoken surveyor named Jeff, had another reason. He'd been double-checking parcels in the area and found a filing discrepancy from the early 1990s. A sliver of land, roughly half an acre, had been misclassified as belonging to a defunct development company. But records showed Emily and Elias had purchased that strip as part of a larger tract years earlier. That half acre included a small grove of trees just behind the HOA office, the very place where Elias used to take Emily on evening walks. where they tied colored ribbons to saplings for every year of marriage. Jeff's finding meant the HOA building wasn't just partially on Elias's land, it was entirely on it. The entire office, parking area, and landscape buffer zone stood on his property. Every legal assumption made by the HOA about its place in the neighborhood, its authority, its centrality, was built on stolen ground. This changed everything. With this revelation, Elias filed a quiet title action through the county court to officially reclaim ownership. It took several weeks of legal back and forth, but in the end, the court sided with Elias. The building was his. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he walked into the vacant HOA office, unlocked the dusty front door with a county-issue key, and stood silently in the echoing quiet. The walls were covered in cork boards filled with notices, warnings, and maps marked with color-coded tape. The furniture had been cleared out in a hurry after Karen's suspension. On a corner desk sat a leftover coffee mug that read, "Make rules, not excuses." Elias chuckled bitterly and tossed it into the recycling bin. After conferring with Liam, Elias made his decision. He would not repurpose the building for profit, nor would he lease it out. Instead, he filed paperwork to turn the property into a community legal resource center, free consultations for homeowners dealing with land disputes, wrongful enforcement, or unfair association practices. He named it the Thorn Resource House, in memory of Emily, whose meticulous document saving had helped spark this entire chain of events. Liam, now applying to college with an interest in environmental law, would spend afternoons there helping sort files and scan documents. The two of them built a tiny reading room inside, where people could browse old zoning maps and learn about their rights. Over time, the once feared building became a space of quiet empowerment, a place where people came not to be judged or fined but to understand how to protect their homes. As for Karen, her suspension led to a full county ethics investigation. The letter she'd written to Elias, once considered a personal confession, was now public record. Her signature, handwriting, and other documents were matched against known forgeries. She avoided criminal charges through a plea agreement, but was barred from serving on any governing board or association for a decade. She moved out of the neighborhood soon after, citing hostile public opinion and a campaign of personal destruction. Though few were sympathetic, the HOA was officially dissolved 6 months later. Its assets were liquidated, and the remaining funds were distributed back to residents in the form of rebates. While not everyone agreed with the process, a majority welcomed the change. What had once been a quiet community full of suspicion and fear slowly transformed into a place of mutual respect and cautious optimism. People began talking more. Barbecues returned. Elias's porch once again became a place where people gathered, not to strategize or worry, but to laugh and share stories. Elias sometimes sat there in the evenings, watching the shadows stretch across the ridge, thinking of Emily and everything they had built. There was a sense of closure, yes, but also something more enduring, the knowledge that justice, however slow, is still possible when one refuses to be silenced. That legacy matters, not just in land deeds and property lines, but in how we choose to stand our ground when everything we love is threatened. And in the stillness, he knew that what they had rebuilt was not just a home, but a line in the sand, drawn with calm hands and an unwavering heart. As the seasons changed and autumn rustled through the trees that bordered Elias Thorne's land, the cabin stood quiet and firm, warm from within by wood smoke and a growing sense of community that had once seemed impossible. The legal battles were behind him now, the threats gone, but what lingered was a profound shift in how he saw the world, and how the world saw him. He had been cast, not by choice, into the role of challenger, protector, rebel. Yet he had never fought for attention, never raised his voice to be loud. He had simply refused to yield. That choice, that quiet defiance, rippled outward. Over time, Elias began receiving invitations to speak at town halls and legal forums across the state. Local law schools reached out to ask if he would talk to students about homeowners' rights. And in a twist that still felt surreal to him, a small documentary crew from a regional PBS affiliate came to film a short segment about his story. At first, he hesitated. He didn't want to become some symbol for a movement or turn his life into a headline. But Liam encouraged him. "People need to see what one person can do," his son said, "especially when they're scared." So Elias told his story, calmly, clearly, and with the kind of honesty that could only come from someone who had lived it in the marrow. He spoke not in sweeping ideology, but in details. The way they cut the power in the middle of the night, the tone in Karen's voice when she'd smiled while issuing threats, the look in Liam's eyes when the social worker arrived. He described the terror that doesn't always come with sirens or screams, but with quiet violations, when systems pretend to protect while working to undermine. What struck viewers most wasn't the drama, though there had been plenty of it. It was the humanity. The love for his late wife, the porch they'd built with calloused hands and shared vision, the grief he carried in silence, and the home that held all those memories. When the segment aired, hundreds of emails and letters poured in, some from nearby counties, others from as far as Florida and Pennsylvania. Viewers saw themselves in Elias. Not just in his fight, but in his love, his grief, and his refusal to back down. Back in the cabin, life found a gentler rhythm. Liam was accepted into a university in Oregon with a scholarship for public interest law. On weekends, he still drove back home to help out, chop firewood, and hike the ridge trails with Elias. The two of them spoke often now, not just as father and son, but as men who had been tested and come out stronger. Sometimes, they didn't talk at all. They didn't need to. The shared work, the rebuilding, the laughter over Emily's old jokes, it was enough. One afternoon, as snow flurried lightly outside, Elias opened a faded envelope from the county clerk's office. Inside was a certified copy of the final order dissolving the HOA's charter. It included a brief statement noting that the community was now free to self-organize without legal enforcement mechanisms or mandatory dues. The paper was thin, almost unimpressive, but it marked the end of something heavy. Elias set it on the mantel beside an old photo of Emily holding a young Liam in her arms. For the first time in years, he felt like a page had truly turned. Not long after, Elias received a visit from Robert, the neighbor who had once betrayed him. Robert stood at the edge of the property, hat in hand, eyes downcast. Time had worn hard on him. His face was weathered, not just by age, but by guilt. Elias didn't say much at first, letting the silence stretch. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he said. "I believe them. I shouldn't have. I told myself I was keeping peace, but really, I was just afraid of being targeted next." Elias studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fear makes people do strange things," he replied. "It's what they counted on." Robert looked like he wanted to say more, but instead, he extended a small paper bag. Inside were jars of honey from his own hives, and a note that simply read, "Thank you for standing when the rest of us didn't." Elias accepted it without ceremony. Not because it erased the past, but because he believed people could grow, especially when the soil had been turned so deeply. The resource house, once the heart of HOA enforcement, became something entirely new under Elias's care. Over time, it attracted retired paralegals, law students on break, and neighbors who simply wanted to help others navigate complicated systems. They hosted community nights where residents could share experiences, trade resources, or just sit over coffee and talk. The building was no longer a monument to control. It had become a beacon of shared resilience. Through this all, Elias kept a notebook, something Emily had once encouraged him to do. In it, he wrote thoughts, reflections, sometimes just a single sentence. One page read, "We never win by shouting louder. We win by refusing to sit down when they tell us to leave." Another page bore a note to Liam. "The world will always have Karens, son. Just make sure you know where your roots are before someone tries to pull them up." When a local publisher approached him about turning his story into a memoir, Elias politely declined. "The story belongs to more than me," he said. But he agreed to let them publish a short essay adapted from his experience, titled "The Line They Crossed." It went on to win a regional award for nonfiction, not for its style, but for its quiet moral clarity. Years passed. Liam graduated, then returned to the region to open his own small law practice, focused, like his father's efforts, on property rights and landowner advocacy. The resource house remained central to their efforts, and Elias, now older, stepped back to let younger voices lead. He still tended the garden, fixed the loose boards on the porch, and told stories to the new volunteers who came through. The light strung across the porch still glowed each night, faint, steady, unbroken. Sometimes, people would stop by just to sit on that porch and ask Elias how he'd done it, how he'd won. He always answered the same way. "I didn't win. I just didn't give up." That's not the same thing, but sometimes it's enough. And perhaps that's the real heart of it. Elias Thorne didn't defeat the HOA with fiery speeches or dramatic showdowns. He won because he knew what he was fighting for, and who he was fighting for. He won because he stayed when it would have been easier to leave. He built, even while they tried to tear down. He protected, even when others walked away. And in doing so, he reminded everyone around him of something quietly radical, that the law is only as strong as those willing to stand behind it, and that home, true home, is not just a structure, but a sacred trust. The land still remembers. So do the trees, and the porch, and the hands that built it all. And through Elias's story, so will we.